Back in 1980, two people, one from Apple Computers and one from Aetna Insurance, asked Ty Boyd to teach their executives to better communicate with their customers. So Ty Boyd and his wife and business partner Pat developed Executive Learning Systems, which led to the founding of the Excellence in Speaking Institute. After 28 plus years, the Institute now boasts graduates from every state and province in North America, as well as 40 countries. Ty has delivered over 4,000 keynotes and seminars on 5 continents to over 1 million people, his largest audience being over 80,000 people. Can you imagine that? When you meet Ty, you are immediately struck by his resonant broadcaster's voice, his genuine interest in what you have to say, and his boundless energy and enthusiasm. I've spoken at the Carolina chapter of the National Speakers Association twice, and both times I've looked out into my audience to see Ty smiling back at me and nodding his head as he furiously jotted down notes from what I just said, as if after 30 plus years in the speaking business, he still has room to grow and improve, which is another reason to listen and learn from Ty Boyd. He's not just a great teacher, he's an avid student. Ty is the author of 2 books, The $1 Million Toolbox and Visions from the Leaders of Today for the Leaders of Tomorrow. It was quite an honor to sit down with this speaking legend and to see what nuggets he had to share. Now, in discussing story, in the early days, you say you had after-dinner speakers and they would string together 4 or 5 stories. Tell me a little bit more about that. Were people more storytellers in the early days and less content-rich, or was it a very different industry back then in relation to stories?
I don't know that one suffered at the expense of others. Although I'm not sure I remember so many things that people said. I remember stories they told, as still is the case. But my role models were people like Bill Gove, who was an incredible, playful storyteller. Cabot Robert. Cabot didn't make a speech for pay, not as a speaker, until after he was 65. So the story goes. And so Cabot was he was at his zenith when he was my age. Which is a few years advanced of 65.
Right. Were these people using stories as the foundations of their keynotes? And in the early days, did that influence you as well? Or were speeches put together differently back then?
I don't think I had a model that was attractive, that was anything other than storytelling. For instance, I had a science teacher who put me to sleep in school, consequently took that course more than once. And then I met a guy on Nova on television, a Dr. Carl Sagan, who talked about the same mysteries of the universe, but told them in such storyteller fashion that I would stay home from big-time events just to see Carl Sagan on television. And the difference is not the content. The difference is the delivery, not the message, but the messenger. And successful messengers are those who tell stories.
What do you believe it is about story that is so compelling, that holds people's attention in such a uniquely different way than anything else does?
Well, the professorial way to take that apart would be that we have a left brain and a right brain. We have facts and feelings, we have creative and academic. And so with the facts, we attract a certain number of our group. And with the feelings, we attract a certain number. And all of us having both left and right brains, if we can do it adroitly, if we can structure it well, we can capture almost everyone in the hall with both facts and feelings.
So as you talk about the left brain, right brain, and the different kinds of people in the audience, you're talking about adult learning styles, and that some people are much more drawn to facts and data, and some people are much more spatial and emotional and spiritual in their outlook. And so the more that you use stories correctly, the more you catch everybody.
Better said. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I have found in my study of stories, and I'd like to hear your take on this, is if we have a content piece, a point that we want to make, it will stick at a much deeper level and for a much longer period of time if that content piece is followed by imagery and emotion in the form of a story.
Yes. Oh, when you tell that story, and forgive me if I don't have it exactly right, but you tell the story running naked down the street.
My streaking story.
Oh my! It's an interesting fact when you begin it. When you play it out, it is incredible. I mean, I can see you. I think you ought to lose about 5 pounds. I mean, it just comes alive. And of course I remember that. And of course the audience is taken to a different level with that. And I remember one little thing you said, I change positions here. Now, what an insight. I change, you say, I turn a little here. Mm-hmm. All of this is to enhance the story. You don't do this first time, and you do some of it instinctively. And Billy Grove used to talk about crafting a story. I remember hearing Billy Grove in conversation. We'd be having a beer and maybe a hamburger somewhere. And Billy Grove would tell me a wonderful story just in conversation. I'd hear him tell it 15 years later. Same execution. I mean, stories don't just come off. They do come off the top of your head, but your great ones, your signatures, don't.
Well, the signatures start out off of the top of your head.
Yes, they do.
But if you understand craft and form and structure and sequence and a little bit of acting, then over a period of years, it becomes what I call a mini play.
Yes.
It becomes a piece of theater. And at that point, what you're saying with Billy Grove, it's that over a period of time, at a certain point, you turned it into a play. You've got the script, you've got the motion, you've got the staging, and you stop farting around with it and you start replicating it and polishing it. Now, do you have stories yourself like that, Ty? And I'm sure that you've got some stories that you've been telling for many years.
For years, I had a story from New Orleans that I had gotten wonderful service at the Hyatt Regency in New Orleans. It's called a Woody story, for which I think I had some identity. And it was a fabulous story about customer service. And people would always say, be sure to tell the Woody story. Now in our classes, I set up day 3 with a story at the end of day 2 with a story called the Zipline story. Larry Wilson, who's a fabulous and is to this day a fabulous presenter. And Larry had a place called the Pecos River Conference Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, out of Santa Fe. And he invited a whole group that I belonged to called Speakers Roundtable. And we went to the Pecos River Conference Center. And Larry said, we're going to work all day, play all night, and on Sunday, we're going to take a zip line ride. And we told him it sounded like a Disneyland adventure for us until we took that zip line ride. And then I tell the story of the zip line. You act out the... So
you act it out.
And isn't the world theater anyway, Doug? The world is theater. Some of us play our parts poorly. Others of us, I would say I fit in both categories, work on some of it and make it more interesting. But the world is theater. I mean, I watch 2 birds court each other. That's theater.
That is theater.
Peacocks, that's theater.
It is theater. Well, life is incredibly colorful, and the premise behind story theater is that when you experienced the story that you're telling, when you experienced the reactions and the emotions and the shock or the joy or whatever it is that was going on in the story, you were physical, you were verbal, you were emotional, you had all of this theater going on. But then sometimes when we come to tell the story, we tell it, but we don't show it. We forget that it's like, wait a minute, when it happened to me, it was a full body experience.
Right.
Now, with your zip line story, does it become that visual for your audience because you are doing some of that motion and taking those reactions and bringing them back into the moment so that it is theater?
I perspire when I tell that story. No, excuse me, I sweat.
You sweat.
Damn right. And yes, you're right. But we are talking in Orlando, Florida. Disney. Was Walt Disney theater or was he business?
Brilliantly both. When you are crafting a story, what is your process?
I certainly didn't know about a process, except I knew that all my role models did. For instance, I was asked to speak to a group of Toastmasters. It was one of those regional gatherings of Toastmasters. And so I began to put together a little 15, 20-minute, which is tough to do, by the way, as you know. And out of that, I got 2 or 3. I wouldn't say they were signature stories, but I got stories that I think probably the zipline story started that way. And then working on it. I practice a lot, Dale.
How when you say working on it, if you have an idea for a story and you're about to go out and do it, but you've not done that story before, so for the Toastmasters in specific, you're thinking, I want to give them something different. They're a little bit different audience, and you start conceptualizing. Do you put pen to paper? Do you write anything? Do you bullet point a story in sequence to make sure that this happened and then this happened? Is there any of that structural work on paper or
yes,
on a keyboard?
You bet. Not on a keyboard, probably with a pencil and a pad. And I never write it out. I cannot write the way I speak. And I'm not lazy. In this instance, I practice a lot. And so I will time things and tell a story over and over, or probably do a whole vignette or a whole part of a talk over several times.
So this is out loud and on your feet.
Absolutely. Out loud with all of the emotions, with all the feeling, all the movement. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I will turn, as you said, I will turn.
So are you using some visualization while you're standing there walking and talking? Are you using that imaginative state where you see yourself in front of an audience?
Lots. And not only that, but I relive whatever that experience is, if it's a personal experience, and really try to get into it, and yet get into it in a lean kind of way.
Now, that must also then be a part of your process, that as you work it out on your feet out loud, a sentence will come out, and the sentence will last for 4 minutes, and you'll realize, okay, we're going to have to do something with that sentence, because, where was the nugget in there?
Yeah.
So you also hear the language coming out of your mouth, hear if it's too confusing, start to edit it down. Does that ever end up on paper, or do you now have this facility after many years to just work out the language in your mind and rehearse and memorize what you'd worked out, and then be able to take that onto the platform?
Well, I never memorize unless it's a quote. I try to tell it free form from bullets, but after I've practiced enough, the words are always the same. But if I screw up and miss a word, I don't have to go back to to line 1 and start all over again. So I've always tried to storytell free form, but the words they always come in the same sequence. I just don't want to memorize. I mean, I guess you do memorize, don't you? Well,
obviously you are memorizing, because if they end up coming out the same way every time, you have memorized your lines. But what I'm hearing is there's a part of you that says, I don't want to memorize because I don't want to become robotic.
Correct.
I don't want to become canned. I want it to still have life. But in the end result, the lines are exactly the same, and you don't become robotic. And isn't that theater? Isn't that acting?
That's theater, absolutely.
That's what acting is. It's the same lines every night, but it's not robotic.
That's and I remember the Sarnoff who played opposite Yul Brynner in The King and I for I don't know how many times Sarnoff played it, but Yul Brynner said something like 10,000 performances or something godly.
Yes.
And she said that he would come in 30 minutes, an hour early before every performance to get up, not get down, get up, so that as though it was the first time he'd ever done it.
Right.
And your whole background's theater in that respect.
Yes. Well, there's also a difference between those of us, you and I, and the people who've been doing this for a while, who have a facility for being able to memorize and still bring it to life like an actor. Because I don't want to teach an executive to do that, because the executive doesn't have the facility that we have.
Yeah.
And they will just end up doing words in sequence without bringing it to life. And you and I have the ability as performers to memorize and still bring it to life every time. And isn't that the difference between good memorization and bad memorization? When you use a story, such as my story theater methodology, where you are taking the thread of a story, the narrative of a story, and making it come alive, as you have said a number of times, what would you say to the people who are coming in as speakers now who have stories, but the stories are a minute, they're a minute and a half, they're 2 minutes long, and they're basically the skeleton of the story, the outline of it, but there's no meat on the bones? What would you say to those speakers to help them to embellish and add texture and deeper color, as you say, to their stories?
I would, and I don't mean this to be subscribing to your theater method, but I'd tell them to take a Doug Stevenson course. I've had one. I know what it's like, and to see how you help us to flesh out stories and look for feelings, look for things that are happening, and look for events that all color the story more richly. I'd say go. You can take light years off your learning curve by going to someone who does it extremely well, and so I would seek help. I'm not a great storyteller because I know how to tell stories. If I've had any success in storytelling, it's just my probably fear of failure. I've just kept on working at them until they became pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this. What are the lengths of some of your stories that you've used over and over again? Your signature story, like you say the zip line story, is that one of your signature stories?
It's probably 8 minutes long. It's a long story.
But that's a good length, isn't it? It's got enough depth and enough detail to really draw the listener in, but then you make a point at the end.
I sat with one of my a young man that used to work with us in our company who's now doing 100, 150 speeches a year around the world. And I said, what has helped you the most? And he said, well, a couple of things. And then he said, watching you do that zipline story at the end of each of our sessions, or at the end of the second day of each of our sessions, it helped me to see what really complete storytelling is all about. And he went back and kind of took it apart, said, here's what I learned here, and here's what I learned here.
Now, when he analyzed what you did, what ingredients did he say about watching you were the things that he learned from you?
Well, he had those visceral feelings. He also was climbing up the side of the mesa, and he also had that fear of heights. You know, he said, I could feel all of that going on. And I would say the only thing dry on my body was my mouth, and I was frightened. You know, I think he was just learned to add color, because he's kind of an above-the-line guy. And so where creativity and storytelling comes more to you and me, we would say naturally, he had to really work on it. But he's a very fine student, and so that was what he had learned from that story.
Now, just from watching you as you're sitting here in this chair and listening to you talk about that, I can sense that when you speak, you are a very physical and emotionally integrated speaker and storyteller. And that you said, well, when I'm done telling that story, I'm sweating.
I'm worn out.
I'm worn out. Mm-hmm. A lot of the speakers that I work with approach this very cerebrally, and they're very much in their head, and they're just so thick with content that they get themselves confused as well as their audience, but they never raise a sweat because their body isn't into it. What would you say about that aspect of putting your body into it, putting your emotions into it?
Number one, I would say that somehow we have to put our passion into what we do. And secondly, I would say go where you would go if nobody could see you. You know that thing?
Yes.
And be that person. Don't be afraid to screw up. So just keep pushing. Probably what you think is outlandish isn't.
I have a lesson that I teach to my speakers because I believe most speakers are too tentative at the beginning. They're too tentative.
You just say it better than I.
They're so afraid to do anything that might offend that they don't even come close to being offensive. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the lesson. Safe is a very dangerous place to be. Safe is a dangerous place to be as a speaker. We've got to push the envelope. We've got to get out there and go for it. And this new speaker's desire to be accepted, I believe, causes them to be tentative and to not take a story all the way. Take that story as far as it can go. Go ahead. And for 1 out of 100 speakers, they're going to go too far. But for 99 speakers out of 100, they're not going far enough.
I know in my own experience, I tried to use quotes from other people for years until I had the courage to tell my own stories. And I see presenters today who are so much like me in feeling that they're authentic. They are not at all. They are somebody else, telling somebody else's stories. And though they're interesting and their mechanics are good, the outcome is pedestrian. And then I see people who are far more limited, maybe even in their scope of both intellectually and experience, who are far more entertaining because they're willing to step out into the deep water. Your point, with their own stories and their own material.
What is the difference between telling your own story and telling someone else's story? Why is it so much more powerful to tell your own story, Ty?
You know, I've always felt sorry for the people who were Elvis impersonators, because they can only be a copy, and they can't be authentic. And if we can't be authentic, we're not going to be very effective people. And I think that's just a lesson in life. Authenticity is not playing it safe. Authenticity, necessarily. Authenticity is being who you are at your core. And when you can be that on the platform, you are powerful. It isn't about being perfect, is it? It's about being effective. And being effective is using all the tools that you have and being willing to be unveneered. We know we say the authentic speaker is the one that strips away all the veneer. And storytelling is a powerful tool.
And if it's your story versus someone else's story, doesn't that strip off veneers, as you say? Because you're telling your truth.
Yeah.
And you're being vulnerable and real.
I learned from Jeannie Robertson. She spoke to our chapter many years ago, and Jeannie says, keep a log and ask yourself, what happened to me this morning when I was getting up? What happened over breakfast? What happened on the way to the airport? What happened when I was putting my luggage in the overhead? What happened, when I was talking to the gate agent? What happened to the person sitting next to me? Get some practice by beginning to just flesh them out.
Well, also, I've also noticed that when I'm telling a story that happened to me, as I'm telling it, my imaginative faculty is completely alive because I am seeing the movie. And if I'm seeing the movie while I'm telling the story, somehow it changes my inflection and my emotional connection to that moment. I can't tell someone else's story that way because my movie screen isn't Technicolor. It's not alive. And if I'm telling Ty Boyd's story, I'm giving the skeleton version. I'm giving an outline version because I don't see the visuals.
Really?
I can imagine them, but I can't see them the way you saw them. And I can't react. And to me, storytelling is not just about the narrative. It's about the reactions. It's about those things that we were talking about, like when you see the zip line and you're next and Patricia Fripp goes in front of you, there is a beautiful moment of reaction between when she goes and when you go.
Oh, my.
And isn't that where the emotional power is?
Yes.
I mean, you see that right now, don't you?
I absolutely do.
And you're feeling it right now.
Absolutely. Standing on the edge of that rock 164 feet high and frightened to death of high places.
And as she went across the zip line, did she let out a sound or anything?
Oh, screamed. Are you kidding?
And do you get to react to that scream?
Really?
Of course. And this is where story comes alive. It's not in the narrative alone. It's in the reactions. It's in the spaces in between the words.
Yes.
It's the visual. It's the emotional. It's the kinesthetic.
Yeah.
And that's why your audience says, oh, my God, I was on that platform with you. I was scared to death to go off that line. And yet they're sitting in a chair in an auditorium in a grand ballroom somewhere.
Right. But they're on the edge of their seats and they're very uncomfortable. Oh, I've told that story in many a setting. little rooms, big rooms, and it's always and it's an incredible first-person experience. We were talking about acting and theater, and I say the tools are the same whether you're acting or. I think someone must have said this to me years ago. Doug, I don't know that I have an original thought, but the distinction was made between acting and performing, and one was being someone else and the other was being yourself. But the toolbox is the same. We have the same toolbox. And so what becoming authentic is being willing to use the tools that you have. And my toolbox, I mean, I have arms and legs and eyes and well, you have hair, but you know what I'm saying. We have the same toolbox essentially, but yours comes out differently from mine.
Of course.
And so we don't have to worry about being too much like somebody else, like the Elvis impersonator wants to be just like Elvis. But we want to be authentic in ourselves, and so use the same toolbox. But it's, as you say, it's coming from a deep place inside.
Well, acting. The way that I teach it in my story theater retreats, acting is replicating reality at a future time and space. If you and I experienced the story, we, as an actor would do, have to replicate that reality at a future time and place in the grand ballroom in front of an audience.
Yeah.
So, all right, it's 3:15 in the afternoon. You're doing a closing keynote. Now you recreate that moment from when you were standing on that platform about to do the zip line, but you're recreating your reality. An actor has to recreate a other character's reality and place themselves into it. But we don't have to place ourselves into it. We were there. An actor imagines themselves standing on the top and someone else has just gone.
Yep.
We don't have to imagine ourselves. We have the added benefit of I was there. Now, I do what an actor does. I replicate my reality at a future time and place. That's called story theater. And isn't that what good storytelling is? Even if you don't know what story theater is, isn't that what you've been doing before you ever saw me?
Yeah.
So you don't need me to tell you to do that. You did it instinctively.
Well, but I think you do need to hear someone tell you. It reconfirms what you think might be.
But it's an intuitive process for a good storyteller, is it not?
Yes. In our teaching, and I love teaching, by the way, more than speaking. I love teaching.
So do I.
In our teaching, we say that many of our students come not so much to learn new techniques or new insights, but to validate what they already are and think. And I think that's true. So it's wonderful to have a giant storyteller to spend a day with you. It's really something. And then you do that so well.
In order to help someone who's listening to this become amazing, not just competent as a speaker, but to really get up there and just be amazing, what does that require? What have you found that, because I know as we start out tentative, we start out hiding behind content, and then eventually at a certain point, as you've experienced, as I've experienced, after hundreds of speeches, maybe not hundreds, but a certain period of time, you start to break through and you show up.
So I think confidence plays a great piece of that. We step out, we get applause, we get the positive feedback, we step a little further. And I think that's when we become amazing. I think of people that I've seen on the NSA platform. And what I guess I did know this, but I didn't think of this. That guy's been working for years to be there, and to be as amazing as she is or he is. They've paid their dues. They worked hard at their craft. I do remember that Sir Laurence Olivier was still taking voice lessons and acting lessons the year that he died.
No matter how long you're a speaker, there's always something new to learn that gives you just that one nuance that you are the only person who knows, I did that one thing today that I've never done before. And at this point in your career, there are no great breakthroughs for you. There is just nuance.
Yeah.
There is just a brush stroke of improvement here and there. And doesn't that give you satisfaction?
Oh, my. Oh, my.
Isn't that what it's all about?
Oh, my.
At a certain point, anyways, there's no breakthroughs anymore. There's no, like, oh, my God, revelations that will change everything I've ever done. Because, no, you don't want to.
Willie Sutton said, I rob the banks because that's where the money is. And if you want to become better at this craft, go where the great performers are. So I'd recommend NSA membership to anyone who qualifies to get in, and never stop coming.
Well, my goodness. Ty Boyd, it has been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with you and to glean pearls of wisdom from you. Thank you so much.
And for me, thanks, Doug Stevenson. Look forward to taking your next course.
One of the first and most important points that Ty made was that the messenger is as important as the message, because the unique and individual style of the presenter and the creative delivery of the message is what makes it engaging. And without engagement, you've got a bored audience who checks out on you. Another point that he made, and I'm sure one that he teaches his executives, is to step out into the deep water with your own material. I like that concept. To step out into the deep water. The shallow water meaning where it's safe and predictable, and the deep water meaning where it's a little dangerous. Perhaps even uncharted waters. If you want to jumpstart your speaking and leap right past the painful growing pains of your first 100 speeches, stop hiding behind content that you found on a Google search or from reading other people's books, and jump right into the deep water that experienced speakers swim in regularly, the deep water of their own personal stories and the wisdom that comes from their life experiences. One of the ways to step into the deep water is to act out your stories with reckless abandon, to work up a sweat as Ty does with his zipline story. Remember in my interview with Eileen McDarr where she talks about becoming the story? That's what Ty is talking about. Don't tell a story about leaping off the side of a cliff on a zip line as if it was simply an interesting event. Tell it the way it was. Scary, exhilarating, life-threatening. Use your body. Act out the panic and the fear. When Ty said, "The only dry place on my body was my mouth," can't you just see him wiping his sweaty hands on his pants? Ty also made a good point about rehearsing, about his process. And you'll notice that each of these speaking veterans has found their own way of getting to a brilliant performance. But what Ty said was that he rehearses a lot, out loud and on his feet, feeling the emotions and doing the gestures, finding the movement and the staging, finding the voices and inflections. There is really no better way to find your story and all of the amazing moments in it without doing it, without rehearsing on your feet. Unfortunately, for most speakers, they do all their experimenting in front of their audiences, which is what I meant by the growing pains of the first 100 speeches. When you rehearse in front of your audience, sometimes you mess up. I know this from experience, and it's no fun. Take Ty's advice. Rehearse at home. Here are a few solid gold nuggets about rehearsing. Number 1. Find a place in your home or office and designate it as your rehearsal space. This is where you will always go to rehearse. Number 2, schedule 30-minute rehearsal periods. Just like you would with any other appointment, put them on your calendar. You'll never do it otherwise, trust me. Number 3, tell your story out loud and on your feet as if there is an audience in front of you. Look to the left. Look to the right. Look to the center. Move around. Number 4, to make it more realistic, if that's even possible in a rehearsal in your living room, print copies of photos of your friends and family and place them around the room, and then pretend they're audience members. Look at those faces. Make eye contact with the faces on the photos. Number 5, as you tell your story, go full out. Recall the movements and gestures from the moment when the event happened. Replicate reality. That's what good acting is. Replicate your own behavior from that time and place. Number 6, recall the emotions and how the emotions affected your body. If you were angry, What did you do with your hands? If you were in shock, did you move like a zombie or simply stand perfectly still? Number 7. Think of the vocal inflections and volume and tempo changes of your story as the musical score of the movie you are creating in your listener's mind. Don't worry about being too loud or too fast or whatever. Replicate your volume and tempo as well as your movements and gestures and emotion. Remember, if you were telling this story in someone's backyard, you'd probably play it full out, so give your paying audience the same level of passion. Number 8. When you rehearse, take Ty's advice and go where you would go if nobody could see you. That's stepping into the deep water. And finally, number 9, learn to show your reactions rather than telling them. Fill the spaces between the words with thoughts and feelings. This must first happen in rehearsal so you can find the emotions. Remember your reactions, and then take the time to discover how you can show these reactions rather than describing them or narrating them. Your audiences don't just want to listen to what you have to say, they want to feel something. They either watch TV or go to movies just about every day, so it's not like they're unaccustomed to watching good acting. And why do we all go to the movies? To feel something. So as you rehearse, don't just work on the words. Work on the movie. Create mental images. Make motion pictures. Move. Feel. Don't just say it, do it. Step out into the deep water with your own material. And then, once again, I go back to the image I have of Ty Boyd sitting in my audience in a North Carolina hotel ballroom taking notes. Just like Michael Jordan shooting 1,000 free throws, there he was, practicing what he teaches. What was it that he said? Oh yeah, never stop learning. Never stop polishing. Thank you, Ty Boyd. You're an inspiration.
All right, well, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, something that you can use that will make your stories stick, stories that make you and your business memorable, marketable, and monetizable, there are 3 things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow or subscribe button and leave a review wherever you listen. And second, share this podcast with your friends and coworkers, your email list, and on social media. And third, connect with me on LinkedIn. And when you're ready to get serious about taking your stories to the next level, or if you have an important speech, presentation, or TED Talk coming up, or if you want some guidance on how to make the transition to becoming a professional speaker, let's schedule your free 30-minute coaching session where we can get to know each other and see if we're a good fit. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning. You can send an email with your questions, comments, and suggestions to Deborah@DougStevenson.com. That's Deborah, Deborah, @DougStevenson.com. Hey, thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.